I am here today for my podcast, Different Matters, at the excellent offices of Media Works in Auckland. And I'm joined today by Dr. Oliver Hartwich from the New Zealand Initiative, who's up in Auckland today. Oliver, great to see you again.
Great to be with you, Damien.
Now, the reason for this interview is this publication, Leonardo's Legacy. You were tapped on the shoulder to give the inaugural Leonardo da Vinci lecture it's an investment conference in Australia by one of your colleagues or friends. And I get the feeling that you had an idea you wanted to talk about, which was the struggle that the West is facing. But it was called the Leonardo da Vinci lecture. And so you reached in and you grabbed Leonardo da Vinci and you made it fit. And I think you made it fit really well. But let's just start with Leonardo da Vinci and talk, because you write about his initial letter to get job. He was 30 years old, quite young. We're talking about
1482.
1482. That's when he was born. 1482.
No, 1482 is when he applied.
Right. So he applied to get a job for some guy called Sforza. So tell us about his application letter, because this is great.
Okay. So the year is 1482, of
1482.
course. Yeah. I remember 1982 better than 1482. The year is 1482, and a 30-year-old engineer, self-taught engineer from Florence, applies at the court of Ludovico Sforza. Sforza at the time was the strongman of Milan. He later became the Duke of Milan, and Leonardo wanted a job with him. And so he sends him a letter. And in the letter he explains all the things he can do for him. And he presents himself as an engineer, basically as a military engineer. And he says, I can build you portable bridges, I can build you chariots, I can build you catapults that can throw stones like hailstorm. And then at the end of that letter, in which he goes through all of his wonderful engineering achievements, he says, almost as a PS, by the way, I can paint. And I can do all sorts of things. And I can do statues too with marble. And I can do all of these things. But actually, I'm an engineer.
And he says in his letter, Leonardo says, my intention is to consult... that wasn't his letter. He said this later. My intention is to consult experience first, and with the reasoning show why such experience is bound to operate in such a way. And you say that this, which was a century before Francis Bacon, this was the forerunner of empiricism.
Well, I see Leonardo as a forerunner of many things, of empiricism, maybe of enlightenment thinking, of the idea of reason, of experimentation. So in a way, you can say that he was a child of his time. He's very much a Renaissance figure because he's interested in all sorts of things. But in another way, he's actually a child of a different time, of many things that actually really only happened about 100 years after him.
And then in a remarkable segue, you go from there. We are going to cover the Enlightenment and the stuff that happens there, and the Peace of Westphalia, where I think we probably disagree a little bit on that, but I'm a little bit nervous because your knowledge on that is exponentially greater than mine. But a lack of knowledge is not going to stop me giving an incorrect opinion. You then jump in and you talk about our current world, and your kind of starting point is 1989. You are saying that we are living in the Enlightenment world, but things are starting to head in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Where shall we start all of this?
Let's talk about trade. Well, let's talk about the success. Let's talk about the success of the post-World War II era and the American hegemony and Bretton Woods.
Okay. We might actually, if I may, start a little bit earlier.
Yep.
Because otherwise people will be confused what Leonardo has to do with any of that.
Yes.
And you would probably say, well, not much anyway, if I got you correctly. My point is actually that Leonardo really stands at the beginning of an era that created the most impressive rise in living standards the world's ever seen. And he stands at the beginning of an era that I think started with the Renaissance, then developed through the Enlightenment, and culminated first in the first period of globalization, which is everything that happened between the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the beginning of World War I. And it was a time characterized by remarkable advances in science, by price stability, by fantastic discoveries, by massive advances in engineering and science and the natural sciences, also by the development of the modern state philosophy, the division of powers, John Locke's views on government and the role of government, protection of property rights. So all of this is really part of an era which created the modern world that we see today. And as I described, it worked miracles really in the 19th century, but got interrupted very brutally, of course, by World War I, which then leads us straight into the catastrophes of the early 20th century, so the world economic crisis, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and then, of course, World War II. And then we get to Bretton Woods, where it is realized by many people at the time that actually, no, we need to have a reliable structure of government and a reliable rules-based international order, which I think then worked for a bit more than half a century. So Bretton Woods, 1944, in New Hampshire, the West comes together and thinks already about the post-war order, while World War II, of course, is still raging. And out of Bretton Woods come the institutions that shape the economic order of the post-war period. So we get the World Bank and we get the International Monetary Fund. We also get the US dollar now as the world's lead currency, convertible still into gold. A bit later, after Bretton Woods, we got other institutions that complemented this order. So we have the United Nations, we have the International Court of Justice, we then have regional cooperations in the form of the European Economic Community, and later EU, ASEAN. And on the defense front, of course, we've got NATO. What they all have in common is that they really depend on the United States' hegemonic power after World War II. And what they then share is that they are all expressions of this post-war, US-guaranteed Western hegemonic order. And in 1989, with the collapse of communism, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then a couple of years later with the demise of the Soviet Union, that system seems to have worked for a while. And that's when we get this almost triumphalist Francis Fukuyama book on the end of history. And I think this probably lasts, this moment, this end of history moment, probably until 9/11, and that's when history brutally restarts. Then that's when we have a new confrontation in the world. Then we have the global financial crisis. Then we have COVID. Then we have Brexit. Then we have Donald Trump. And suddenly, this world order that looked so orderly and so successful, the rise of globalization, seems to be now on the ropes.
So, so your thesis, you're talking about the 5 crises of the current era. And so I just want to kind of map out for most of us in our living memory, we go back to World War II, and there is a sense that things did really well, which is in the Bretton Woods era. And then you had a period of enormous economic growth, the American hegemony, and then, as you say, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And now we seem to be in a period of potentially a polycrisis, I think you call it. So that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the 5 crises. But before we can really understand Bretton Woods, so we know where we're going, let's now dive back. So we got the 30 Years' War, which ends with the Peace of
Westphalia,
which was 1648
in Münster and Osnabrück.
Yes. So essentially, it sounds a bit random. They had essentially the same treaty negotiated in 2 different places, so everybody could negotiate on common ground. It sounds, because I was rereading it or catching up on it last night, the 30 Years' War was basically Catholics, Calvinists, and Lutherans beating the bejesus out of each other for an entire generation, with something like 4 to 8 million deaths.
Yeah, and in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, up to 50% of the population. Staggering.
It was staggering. Now, you make a lot on Westphalia, and maybe your knowledge of this would be better than mine. My understanding of the Peace of Westphalia was that there was an agreement of borders, and there was an acceptance that princes could choose their religion, and ideally the religion of their subjects. You go further, though. You say that Westphalia was the start of the nation state. You were saying that this is where the concept of the nation state was bedded in, and that you flow on from there to say that this provided certainty commercially, because then you had individual defined powers. I'm not too sure I quite agree with that. When I look at the Holy Roman Empire, it still seems like a quagmire of mess.
Well, but it was a much bigger mess before Westphalia. Okay. So it probably just shows our respective prejudices. So you as an Anglo person, of course, would not really think much of the Peace of Westphalia, and me as a German. Well, we grew up thinking that this is really the foundation of all that we see today, because that's the birth of the sovereign state and the birth of the nation state. But maybe that's just my prejudice as a German. And by the way, I was born in Westphalia, so maybe that's why. And I visited Münster.
I thought you were born in Essen.
No, I was born in Gelsenkirchen, just across to the north, and Gelsenkirchen is part of Westphalia.
Okay.
But I never lived there. I then lived in Essen, and Essen is part of the Rhineland. So I'm a split personality.
But actually, you're right, because when my view of history, I go back and I think of the Heptarchy, and I think of Wessex, so that's.
Well, let's put this on the table. I think where we come from determines our view of history in some ways. In a similar kind of way that will probably seem like heresy to you, I'm not even so sure whether Magna Carta is that special, because there were similar kind of agreements between the princes and the nobility on the continent as well. So Magna Carta
about the same time?
About the same time. So actually, I'm not entirely sure whether Magna Carta in that sense is unique. But in a similar kind of way, you would probably downplay the significance of the Peace of Westphalia then. So I think it just shows where we're coming from.
That's okay. All right. Fair enough. But if nothing else, Westphalia is happening right on. So Westphalia is happening at about the time that Francis Bacon is pushing empiricism, and empiricism is the idea that we can work out what is true by studying things and doing experiments. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, but what I would also say about Westphalia, it is the idea that you can order international relations through reason. We find a reasonable compromise, something that actually people can live with. And that kind of blends nicely into the development of legal philosophy at the time. So you would have seen that I mentioned Grotius as the great legal theorist of the time.
Who?
Hugo Grotius, the Dutch lawyer.
Yes.
One of his contributions is actually to introduce a legal system that is no longer dependent on God, but that would actually work even without recurrence to something supernatural.
Yeah, because I've got a quote from him, and this is from Hugo Grotius, who died in 1645, and he wrote, "What we have been saying would have a degree of validity even if we should concede that which cannot be conceded without the utmost wickedness, that there is no God, or that the affairs of men are of no concern to him."
Exactly.
So this, one of the reasons why I was interested in Westphalia is that religion is at the heart of the 30 Years' War.
Yes.
And is, at least in my reading of it, is at the heart of the peace. The idea that you made the comment the other day, in Westphalia, was it, because my reading of it is that the settlement meant that the prince could choose his religion, but people inside his principality were free to choose their own faith.
No,
incorrect.
That's incorrect. No, the princes could definitely choose their own religion, but they could then determine the religion of their citizens.
And
subjects, not citizens.
And other other nations under that agreement had no right to go and interfere.
Precisely.
And that's where potentially you are thinking this is the origin of the nation state in a sense, because once I agree as a prince that you, as a prince in a neighbouring state, have the right to choose the religion of your subjects, I have no right to interfere with that.
Correct.
I am acknowledging your boundary and your
And you
sovereignty.
are acknowledging the sovereignty. And again, this is an application of reason, isn't it?
It's an application of reason, but here because I want to talk about religion, because I actually think, and again, we're talking about our different perspectives. So you and I live in very different mental universes because of our different views on God. And so because I find this aspect so interesting. And so I want to talk about this when we talk about the 5 polycrises, about whether we are seeing the world differently because of the way we think about that. But Hugo Grotius, I really like what he is saying, because he is trying to devise a system of international law based on natural law. He's the one who writes about, I think he was the first one who comes up with the just cause for war. That's him. And he is saying there is a basis for human action that is independent of God.
Yes.
That must have been unbelievably radical at the time he was saying it, or was that just part of the ferment?
No, it was certainly radical. I mean, he wrote all of this while there was a massive religious war going on in Europe. So Grotius wrote all of this while the 30 Years' War was still actually raging. He wrote this before the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And in that sense, he's basically a forerunner of the order that was only created there. In a way, you could say that Grotius probably knew that at some stage a new order would be needed once this war is over. And then he was asking himself, on what principles could this be formed?
The other guy we talk about, or you write about here, is Emma de
Fattel. Yeah.
Emma de Fattel. Where is he from? Is he German?
No, he's Swiss.
Swiss. He might still be German. Was he German-Swiss? You can never tell with the Swiss.
I believe he was French-Swiss.
Oh,
I might be totally wrong.
He was suspect then.
But in any case, I mean, where Fattel, if I pronounce the name correctly, I'm never quite sure with his name, but where he takes it to is basically the conclusion or the continuation of where Grotius started about 100 years before him.
Yeah.
But all of this really stands in this move towards a reasonable system of law based on natural law, not on some divine providence. And I mean, if you want to take Anglosphere writers and thinkers into it, I mean, John Locke is the same kind of development at the time.
Give us a 1-minute summary of natural law.
I'm not sure whether that's possible to give a 1-minute summary of natural law, but basically the idea is actually to come up with a system that doesn't derive its highest legitimacy from God anymore. That we believe that we've got some innate, inherent right because we are human.
So why, under natural law, why can I not murder you to take your goods?
Because you couldn't make this a universal principle. If you take this into, once again, German philosophy, Immanuel Kant, the famous categorical imperative. Kant says you could only make things a rule that could be universally applicable. I mean, if I summarize this very crudely. So you could not murder someone because if that became the universal rule, you could be murdered yourself.
It is. I've always considered natural law. There's an aspect of utilitarianism to it. It's very difficult, I think, to if you look at it from a utilitarian perspective, it seems to work.
I am not so sure anymore. I mean, utilitarianism started, of course, a little bit later. We think of Jeremy Bentham. We think of the maybe 1820s, 1830s in Britain. It's interesting, actually, you mentioned utilitarianism here because I just recorded a podcast last week with a legal scholar on Adam Smith and the common law, and we talked about utilitarianism there. The utilitarian perspective on the common law, on natural law, would be completely different because it's, for example, very open and positive about the possibility of legislation, whereas if you're coming more from the other side, from the natural law side, from the common law side, of course, you believe that the law is something to be discovered but not to be legislated for. And so there's a preference for common law rather than legislation.
Natural law common law is something to be discovered.
Common law is some law that is to be discovered, that is not legislated, so there are no acts of parliament.
Yeah.
It is something that judges form and build on precedent. And that's basically how British law, English law, had developed over centuries until the 19th century, roughly, where Parliament became more active, where Parliament initially started to codify existing laws, so basically write on what has already been decided. But then, of course, over time became more activist and actually created new rules out of thin air, rules where there were previously no rules and no judge-made law.
All right, so we're going a bit off track, but it's interesting. So we have all of this stuff coming out of Westphalia. We have Enlightenment values. We have John Locke and the dignity of man, and then we have Napoleon, who just upends everything in a spectacular fashion.
Yes,
but then he comes to an end. And the way he comes to an end, I think you don't talk about it. The way he comes to an end was almost the application of the ideas that had come up before. That there was a collective decision that this guy must be brought to heel.
Yep.
And he was twice. And then I think it was was it the Prussians who came in over the top and finally knocked him on the head at Waterloo?
Oh, the Prussians certainly helped. Yes.
Yeah. So. But then we have, you describe it as a concert of Europe, 1815 to 1914. And this was, I guess, the theory in action for a century.
Yeah. So basically what we get in 1815 is the old powers of the world coming together, trying to restore order. And that's why it's usually referred to as the Restoration. It is an order that is formalized and agreed to at the Congress of Vienna, 1815, led very skillfully by Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister. And it's basically the European nobility now agreeing on a system where they restore orders, which actually leads to quite a bit of suppression of liberal forces in many European states. Which then, in turn, a couple of decades later, leads to resurgent liberal movements, nationalist movements. You think of, for example, what happened in Germany with the Hambacher Fest, which is basically a party of liberal forces where, for the first time, actually they wave the current German flag, which is a symbol of liberal uprising.
When did this happen? When?
This is in the 1830s. But the old state is still very repressive on the inside. In Germany's case, we probably think of the Göttinger Seven. So it's not the Listener Seven, it's the Göttinger Seven. It's a group of professors protesting against a very draconian, dictatorial, anti-freedom of speech Duke in the Principality of Hanover. So anyway, all of this.
Where did they get these ideas from, though? These ideas were in the firmament there already, right?
Well,
they didn't invent them wholesale.
They didn't have to invent the ideas. The ideas come straight out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, of course, which preceded that period. And they culminate then in the 1848 revolutions all across Europe. But anyway, that's not what we wanted to talk about. What we really wanted to talk about was something else, and that was we have a system of order. So you can say the order was very illiberal on the inside. It was not a good time for freedom of speech. It was also a time where, in some ways, the old Enlightenment ideas were revised, and we're going into a period of Romanticism. Romanticism is, of course, the opposite of the Enlightenment, where it's now all about feelings again. So the peak of the Enlightenment is behind us. We now have a situation where the European powers are coming together to restore order. They restore order on the inside by becoming actually quite restrictive and illiberal, but they're also restoring power on the outside by finding a way in which these different European powers can actually uphold the peace rather than descending into another big war.
It may have been a liberal, Oliver, but what's his name, Keynes, could sit in his bungalow, whatever it was, villa, and order strawberries and newspapers and sweets from all around the globe.
Yeah, but now you're jumping a little bit ahead in time.
Oh, was that in the 30s?
No. Keynes wrote this right on the eve. He didn't write this on the eve of World War One. He wrote this straight after World War One.
Okay.
What you are quoting here is from the Economic Consequences of the Peace.
Yes.
We probably all know that Keynes was a member of the British delegation to negotiate the Versailles Treaty.
Yes.
He was appalled by what the winning forces of World War One imposed on Germany, and then he wrote up his experiences in one of his books, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And in that book, published, I believe, in 1919 or 20 or 21, something like that, he has a passage in there where he reflects on the world that was lost.
Right.
And he said in London in 1914, before the outbreak of World War One, you could sit in your home, order from a catalogue all the goods of the world that you wanted, and expect their timely delivery on your doorstep within a few days. And the only way in which you think this system of the world could change would be for the better and even greater efficiency. That's what Keynes wrote after World War One, about the time right before World War One.
Kind of prescient to where we're going.
Hmm.
Okay, so then we had the First World War. Then we have. Well, there was kind of a resurgence. Then there was the interwar decline. You were talking about the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. You're right, global trade fell by 50% from 1929 to 1933, which was the precursor, I guess, in some ways to the Second World War.
Yes, and I didn't mention the Smoot-Hawley tariff, of course, because we are currently seeing some kind of revival of that mentality.
Smoot-Hawley Mark II.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, depends on what figures you take, but between 50 and probably 60% reduction in global trade within just a couple of years. That was quite extraordinary. And that made the economic crisis of the late 1920s, early 1930s even worse. That also led then in turn to political instability and probably helped those nasty forces in Italy and Germany to gain power.
And now we have...
Can I mention something else before?
Yes.
We should not forget one thing from the interwar period. We had, of course, a functioning global order, a rules-based order, until World War One. And it was taken for granted in the same way that Keynes in his post-war book said, well, the only thing you could imagine is it could get better.
Yeah.
The problem is actually when you're in such a system, you take all of this stuff for granted. And I mentioned in the essay, you would have diversified your portfolio, for example, thinking you're just kind of splitting risks and you're doing the sensible thing and you're not putting all your eggs into one basket. And so I have the fictitious example of an investor in Germany now buying into Russian railway bonds and investing in French equities and having some money, cash in Germany. Doing this before World War I and thinking that actually this is a really balanced portfolio, only to find out 10 years later, after 1923, that all of this would have been worthless because the Bolsheviks would have confiscated your Russian railway bonds. Your French equities would be hidden behind capital controls, and the money in Germany, well, sorry about that, hyperinflation, that's gone too. So you would have actually seen a loss of 100% nearly of your portfolio that you would have held before. And I mention this example because in some ways we are in a very similar situation today where we take a lot of things for granted that are all around us. We think we can trade, we think we can build our portfolios, we think we can basically pretend as if it's still normal kind of globalization. But we should never take any of this for granted. Just in the same way as people before us lost everything, we could lose all of this too if the foundations on which all of the system rests disappear.
And that's where we that's where we get into shortly. All right. So now we're back now to the American hegemony, the Bretton Woods system, the enormous explosion of wealth and trade that occurs as a result of that. We do have a couple of negatives. We have the Cold War. We have Richard Nixon's abandonment of the gold standards in, I think, 1971.
71, yep.
But nonetheless, it all held together. And it even held together through, and then you had 1989, 1991, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then the collapse of the Soviet regime.
Mm-hmm.
And everything seems to be going pretty well. but about well, now we come into the modern era, and now we're talking, and I'm not too sure where you're picking the great unraveling. So what was the date upon which you think that the things start to come unstuck?
Well, I don't think there is a particular date. What I did in my lecture in Sydney is I had one slide with all sorts of different events from the past 20 years. You could say it started cracking with 9/11. You could say it had something to do with the European debt crisis or with the global financial crisis. You may say that we saw some signs of polarization, for example, in Brexit. Then, of course, we had the global pandemic with COVID-19. We had the rise of a much more aggressive militarist Russia. We had certainly a change in the political philosophy of China, where once upon a time we thought, okay, once they become rich, they will demand democracy and they want to become like us. That was the theory of the late 90s and maybe early 2000s. And now we know that's just not true. And then, of course, there's the Donald Trump has had a massive impact on that world order. And so I think you have to take all of these things together. There is no specific date. But one thing we can say for sure, that in the first couple of decades and a bit of the 21st century, where we previously thought history had basically found its end state, or where some people hoped it would have found its end state. I was never quite convinced. We can see that that's certainly no longer true. And the old certainties of the post-war order and the Western order, the Western hegemonic order, and the system that was effectively underwritten by the United States does no longer hold.
So were you right? The great unraveling, in no particular order, I assume. Fracturing of the global commerce, we'll touch on all of them. The fracturing of global commerce, the end of the post-war security, the twilight of Western homogeny, the twin collapse of democracy and civil knowledge, and the AI revolution. But before we dive into all of those separately, I want to talk about Ernst Wolfgang
Böckenförde.
How do you say it?
Böckenförde.
Talk about the Böckenförde dilemma. This is fantastic. I was completely ignorant of this.
Okay, so Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde was a judge on Germany's Federal Constitutional Court. He was a social democrat, and in the 1960s he famously said that the liberal secular state, or actually the liberal secular state under the rule of law, in German it's the Rechtsstaat, depends on foundations that it itself cannot guarantee. So you probably have to pull all of this apart and translate this word by word. So what he says is actually modern states, democracies under the rule of law, secular states, so not states where you say you have an ultimate authority coming from God, and Rechtsstaaten, so a state under the rule of law, so a liberal state. They are sitting on foundations that the state itself cannot guarantee. Because the moment the state tries to institute any of the foundations upon which it wants to stand, it is of course no longer a liberal state, because a liberal state can't prescribe any of this. And he stated this, and this became known as the Böckenförde dilemma. But even at the time, I mean, in the 1960s or even 70s or 80s, this was more theoretical possibility because all the foundations were still there. Western society still worked. Western states still worked. There was a lot that held these societies together from a very practical perspective. I mean, this was the time when people had maybe 2 or 3 TV channels, when they all listened to the same radio programs, watched the same TV programs, and probably read the same newspapers. They were organized in churches, mass organizations, trade unions, even the political parties had a much stronger membership than they have today. And so society had a lot of glue and a lot of kit that held it together. Now, when you go into the present time, what you find is that society has fragmented along many of these lines. I mean, the trade unions, not that I miss them much, but they don't really seem to be as strong anymore as they used to be. The churches have certainly lost membership, and I mean, what is church attendance now? Maybe 2 or 3%. So certainly not the force they used to be. When it comes to the media, I mean, gone are the times when we watch the same TV programs. You now make your own TV program. You go on YouTube and...
We're doing that now.
Exactly. So nobody has to listen to us, and only a tiny, lucky minority will listen to us.
I can't convince my wife.
So, the Birkenförder dilemma is now among us. So we have a society that has disintegrated into its own little bubbles. And the question is then, how do such states still work? And are we eroding the foundations upon which these states are supposed to work? And can the liberal secular state do anything about it? And Birkenförder's dilemma would say, no, it can't.
You're right. When people no longer share institutions, they often no longer share values. Social bonds weaken, common ground narrows. A society of individuals becomes a crowd of strangers. And you write various opinion polls that show like 40% of Americans can't name the three forms of government, three levels of government. I can't even think of the right word. But similarly in Australia and New Zealand, there is a degree of civil disengagement with the society that people live in. And I also wonder, because in New Zealand, I think it's something like 30% of New Zealanders were not born in New Zealand. I think
that includes me.
Yep, and me, to be fair. Although I was born in Australia, so it's kind of like, moving from Hamburg to Dusseldorf, I guess. But
you don't know about Hamburg and Düsseldorf.
No, I just picked two German towns at random. But that also, so you've got, when I'm looking at the disaggregation, I guess, of societies in the West, I'm looking at both the disintermediation, the segmentation of individuals. So you've got the breakdown of institutions, church, all that sort of stuff. People are no longer involved. You've got the ability of people no longer to watch the same television programs. We are atomizing. And then you've got the mobility of labour, which is something that 40 years ago you and I probably would have championed. But now I'm sitting there and I'm looking at cultures like New Zealand and indeed Germany with the large migration things, where you've got a large influx of people that are not integrating as fast as maybe they would have done if the numbers weren't at large. That must be contributing to potentially the
look at me.
Dilemma.
I still don't know how to watch a rugby match or cricket, and I don't get any enjoyment from it.
I think we have to cancel your citizenship. But that must be an aspect of it, right?
It is an aspect.
So I want to come back and talk about the five crises separately. But the Birkenförder dilemma was really interesting, and he writes in this thing about how the state can survive. On the other hand, the state cannot by itself procure these interior forces of regulation. That is, the people themselves must believe in the sovereignty of the individual. So the sovereignty, the legitimacy of the state comes from the individuals, and the individuals must believe in that system.
Yeah,
and if that breaks down...
And people must also understand what the state is and what the state is about. You can see this in our discussions around what Trump does. A lot of the things Trump does require an understanding of what the state is about and what the state is allowed to do. So it takes a certain degree of abstraction to understand that. When Trump ignores court orders, when Trump really goes against the Constitution, his supporters would often say, well, but he got elected. I mean, he got a mandate. That's what he's got elected for. So, yeah. And now he's trying to do what he was elected for. So what's the problem with you? Why can't you see that this is totally legitimate? Because that's what people voted for. And then you would say, well, whether that was what people voted for or not, there are some rules. There is a foundation on which he operates, which is called the Constitution. There are independent courts. There is an independent judiciary. And again, that's part of the constitutional framework. But these are abstract things. If you don't have an understanding of the abstracts anymore, if you don't understand the system, you would not find anything wrong with what Trump does. So again, this is part of the foundation of democracy that we are now undermining or forgetting about. And then it becomes really hard to maintain the values of a liberal democracy?
Because I was thinking about this, and I think you write about it as well. You think about the divine right of kings. You think about where did the Stuarts get their authority from? Indirectly from or directly from God. Where does the Iranian regime get its power from? It's divinely ordained. Where does the Communist Party in China get its from it's got a clear legitimacy baked into the system, right? If the legitimacy of the state rests on the individual believing that the legitimacy of the state comes from the individuals, and they no longer believe that, and then the state can't compel people to believe in that, and then a third of the population come from outside the area, and they haven't, because this stuff takes generations, centuries to bed in.
Yes,
it's and then when it falls down. Because the other thing where I want to talk about religion, because this does seem to be a central aspect of it. Trying to make this work in a secular sense is really difficult. Without God, where does morality come from? If you have God and you have a system by which you can assess right from wrong because you have a religious belief that tells you that, then okay, you can kind of see how. And in the West, there's a Christian tradition of a separation between church and state, which maybe doesn't always exist in other cultures. But do you think that the decline, you said crisis 4, the twin collapse of democracy and civic knowledge, do you think that has gone hand in hand with the decline in religion? If religion was as strong now as it was 50 years ago, would we be facing these problems?
I think we might just as well face these problems even with a stronger church. My argument here is not that the loss of religion led us into our current crisis. And actually, if you want to discuss this whole question in more depth, have a chat with our chair, Oliver Hartwich. He published a long essay in Quillette, actually, on democracy without strong gods, so democracy without religion and without any of these values. So that's not my point, really. My point is actually that we have undermined our foundations in different ways, not least in the loss of deep education and deep knowledge. Once upon a time, I think we instilled these values through our education system, and nowadays we don't even teach history anymore properly. So I think that's one of the answers really to the question, what went wrong here. When you look at the opinion polls, and some of them I quote, among young people in Australia, in Britain, in America, in Germany too, by the way, and you find that they have practically no historical knowledge anymore. They would not know who Stalin and Mao were. They may know who Hitler was, but only because that's basically the only thing that happens on the History Channel. But there's practically no other historical knowledge. I mean, how would you then have a reasonable discussion between young people on whether socialism is a good idea or not if they don't know anything about what happened?
They don't know the history of it. Okay, I think that that dilemma is kind of central to everything else. I may be misreading what you're thinking, but that's what I picked out from it. Let's talk about the great unraveling, the 5 interconnected crises, the fracturing of global commerce. You say global trade, it's a pretty small decline, 2022 to 2023. It's gone from 62.8 to 58.5. Not a huge decline, but significant in a 12-month period. You referenced in there Smoot-Hawley, 1930, where global trade collapsed by 2/3 in 4 years. And of course, our friend Trump is doing the same.
Yeah. Okay, so starting with the term polycrisis, I borrowed that word from Adam Tooze.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, if you go through the references, you can find a wonderful graph where he actually put this together. And I only have 5 crises in my paper. I mean, in Adam Tooze's world, there are probably 20 or 30. Okay. So this list is certainly not exhaustive. I picked 5, from my perspective, the most important ones. But it is a polycrisis. It is a world that's unraveling on many fronts simultaneously. And I try to put together the ones that worry me the most. The fracturing of commerce and the decline of trade is one of them. Yes, the absolute numbers are not quite as terrible and catastrophic as they were in the 1930s. What we do see, however, is that global trade is disintegrating. So where in the 1990s we thought this is all one world and we're basically inviting the whole world to trade with us and with each other, we now see that we have a disintegration of global commerce into different blocks. And we can see this already Western countries are trying to now deal with one another and trade with one another, whereas the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they are trying to form their own system with their own institutions, with their own clearing mechanisms, their own ratings agencies, potentially at some stage their own currency. And so the world is disintegrating on the trade front. And that can only be a bad thing.
Although to some extent that's potentially outside of the control of the West. I mean, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, that's something that is happening independently of us. We couldn't stop that, presumably. Well, we tried we thought trading with China would be a good thing, and I think we did that from the best of intentions.
Yeah, it's by its by own definition outside of the control of the West. They're doing their own thing now, and they're basically telling us that they don't need us, and they're trying to decouple from us. It's not just us trying to decouple from them; they are really trying to actively decouple from us. And if you're Russia, that makes sense, because you want to sell your oil, and you probably don't want to have it denominated in US dollars, and you probably don't want to be reliant on sending money around to get money for your oil on a SWIFT banking system. So of course they're starting their own systems because they want to decouple from us.
Crisis 2, end of the post-war security order. You are talking there about not the disintegration of NATO necessarily, but certainly there's been an attempt to get up to 3.5% on core military spending, but NATO itself, and we were talking just before, where Putin has fired drones at Poland somewhat confrontationally. That's something that he may not have done 10 years ago.
He wouldn't have done that 10 years ago, but of course Putin's aggression started longer than 10 years ago. And he feels emboldened by the fact that the West is so weak to respond to any of this. I mean, the Ukraine crisis goes back to 2014. Mm-hmm. And then the full-scale invasion, of course, happened in 2022. And at some stage, I think Putin will test NATO's integrity. I mean, he's doing that already, if you like. I mean, it's not just with the drones over Poland. He's been doing this for years. He's been attacking undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. They are operating massive spy operations in Western countries. They are undermining also the integrity of Western democracies with all sorts of covert operations. No, it's an ongoing aggression. It's a hybrid war that Russia is waging on the West already.
And again, he's getting away with this because not necessarily that we're not responding. This is we don't have the capacity to respond in the way that we did 10 years ago. We are weaker. The end of the post-war security order, that is a function. Is that a function of potentially some of the other stuff we've been talking about?
Yeah, of course. And Putin gets away with it. You just have to have a look at the response to the drone attack on Poland. Basically, you get statements from Berlin and Paris about how unacceptable this is, and this is an escalation, and we can't have that. Yeah, okay, but we heard that before. On multiple occasions when Russia did other things in the Baltic Sea, for example. So they are getting away with it.
They are. And so potentially is, well, because the other, again, I am surprised, somewhat concerned at the casualness with which we are talking about President Xi taking Taiwan. This was not 5 years ago. This was not a conversation piece. Now it is. I mean, that is a remarkable shift in a relatively short space of time. That is even contemplated.
Because in previous times, the Chinese still probably wouldn't have dared to even contemplate it. because there was always the threat that this would trigger a military confrontation with the Americans. Now that America itself is thinking about taking its own island, in this case Greenland, and everything becomes transactional, well, it depends on what the Chinese have to offer, and then the Americans might just accept it.
Yeah, I think they probably would. Crisis 4, twin collapse, democracy and civic knowledge. We touched on this on the Brookwood Ford dilemma. But you write, when society stopped caring about their own institutions, civic apathism, when nothing feels missing, even when everything has gone. So we've spoken about the dilemma, but talk about what's happening. What's the
apathyism?
Yeah. So the dilemma is a cause. What's the outcome that we are actively seeing?
I borrowed the term apathyism from a book about the decline of Catholic religion in Western Europe. You may have seen that column I wrote for Quadrant some time ago. This book, written by a Catholic theologian at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, argues that previously, of course, there were always atheists denying that God exists, and there are still atheists doing exactly that. But he says there is a new category now. There are people who don't even have any questions about religion. It's just something that doesn't matter to them, that would never occur to them, and certainly not in a way that they would feel strongly about it so that they would say they're atheists. They're just not even atheists. They're nothing. They are apatheists. And I like this concept, actually, and I think it is applicable to the state of democracy. So there are some people for whom democracy doesn't really matter. They're not even thinking about it. It's not as if they can suddenly convert it to autocracy or dictatorships. And it's not as if they suddenly like Putin or Xi or Hitler or Mao. It's just that they don't really care because they basically withdraw into their own private lives and they let politics be politics. And they don't care, they don't pay attention. But that makes it dangerous because I think once we get to that stage where you really don't pay any active interest in matters around you, the system becomes very fragile, in a Böckenförde sense.
You can kind of see that, I guess, in Hong Kong in a way, where I don't know it's necessarily apathy, but the population there seems to have accepted the Chinese extinguishment of the civil liberties that had pre-existed. I understand why people aren't protesting or rebelling, but it's kind of interesting. And then your last crisis is AI. I don't think I quite understood why you thought AI was a part of the polycrisis.
Because I admit it is not a crisis in itself, but it is an amplifier. I think AI amplifies who we are as a civilization. There are some civilizations that will probably look at AI with great skepticism, and the first instinct will be to regulate it rather than to use it. And I'm thinking of Europe, the EU AI Act. I mean, that's what comes naturally to European lawmakers, of course. There is something new, so it moves, so let's regulate it. But in that way, they will never reap the rewards of that new technology. And technological development and economic development will just happen elsewhere because in Europe it doesn't make any sense anymore. Meanwhile, you look at especially developing economies, so countries on lower economic output, they see this as their chance to leapfrog. They want to reap the rewards of engagement with AI, and they will jump into it. And so AI becomes an amplifier of our crisis.
So, I think you mentioned Nigeria, whatever.
Correct. There was a KPMG survey not so long ago, which asked countries, I think about 30 countries around the world, on their attitudes about AI. New Zealand and Australia were really bottom of the list when it comes to being excited about AI. Top of the list were Nigeria, Turkey, Egypt, countries like that. Next question, do you want to regulate AI? And now we've got the flip side. So countries like New Zealand, Australia, and of course European countries are very quick to demand strict, tough regulations for AI. The countries that are most positive about AI and the use in their society are not interested in regulating it. They just want to use it. They want to actually use it to their advantage and leapfrog the West. And in that way, you're probably right, it's not a crisis, but it could be contribute to the West's crisis if it means that we're not participating in one of the most exciting technological developments of the last centuries.
Okay. So you ask rhetorically, the West and the Enlightenment gave us slavery, and it gave us colonialism, and it gave us fascism. So why should we defend it?
Yeah, I ask that rhetorically, and I answer it rhetorically, and it's all true, but it's not the full truth. All of the developments you mentioned certainly came out of Western traditions. But only enlightened societies have a chance to correct these developments, because the Enlightenment is not a fixed dogma. The Enlightenment is a project. The Enlightenment is the use of reason, and it enables you to correct these mistakes. So I mentioned this in the essay, that it was only through Enlightenment principles that we could, for example, end colonialism, that we could end slavery, that we could lead to a society where men and women have equal rights. And it is therefore built into the Enlightenment to correct itself and to move forward. And certainly it is not a fixed dogma.
Wilberforce was a creature of the Enlightenment.
Exactly.
How do you say this guy?
The Vitruvian Man.
Vitruvian Man. Okay, all right. Explain to me why this this was a big feature. It's on the cover of your book.
Yep.
It was a big feature. Why? I don't get it. What is the significance? I mean, isn't this the one that was sent on the Voyager into space?
Yes, yeah, we did.
Yep. Okay. Explain to me, Oliver, why this is so iconic.
Okay, first of all, bit of a background. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated with human anatomy, and especially the anatomy of the male body. Mm-hmm. He also dissected bodies when that was still illegal under religious dogma at the time, mm-hmm. because he wanted to figure out how bodies are built. And apart from that, he saw a certain beauty in the body. So that's a bit of a background. So Da Vinci was interested in this. I mean, he was interested in everything. And now if you look at this picture, the Vitruvian Man, I mean, a few things stand out. First of all, this is a man with 4 arms and 4 legs. I have personally never encountered such a person. When you look more closely, what you see is actually that this person doesn't just stand there. Even though it's a static picture, there still seems to be a lot of movement in that picture. You can kind of guess. I mean, we know how the human body functions. We can guess that this person is somehow moving, and the painter basically captured the body in 2 different poses, mm-hmm. or several different poses, really. So there is a lot of movement in there. The next thing you can see when you look closely into the picture, if this person basically just stands there and does not you can see a square. As the person moves more and stretches, the arms basically form a circle, and the legs as well. And so you've got this picture which is simultaneously a circle and a square. Mm-hmm. And you can interpret that. You can say what you see there in the square is what confines us, what determines where we are, what determines our status, what happens when we don't move much. As we move, as we stretch out, it becomes a circle. And so for me, I think you can interpret this as a metaphor of movement, as a metaphor of stretching, as a metaphor of trying to reach something that is outside our own sphere. And in that sense, if you take this as a wonderful metaphor for the entire philosophy behind not just Da Vinci and the Renaissance project, but also the Enlightenment and everything that I personally stand for, which is I'm a great Enlightenment fan. And when I look at this picture, I see an embodiment, ideally, of the Enlightenment and the attempt to reach something beyond us.
Okay, I understand that. For those who are interested, Leonardo's legacy for both the people who've got to the end. This is available on oliverhartwich.com.
Yep.
And it's a pretty straightforward read. There's lots of footnotes in the back if you want to get into it. I did find it was quite useful to have Google to go back and say, who is this Brockenfog guy? It was great. And reacquainted myself with Francis Bacon, the second end of his outrageous career. All right, Oliver, thank you so much.
Thanks, Damien.